Soren Halvorsen ordered his bride the way ranchers bid at auction, and what showed up would become nothing. He ordered and everything he never knew how to ask for. He'd written it out plain, in a letter to a marriage bureau in Chicago, a woman between 20 and 28, healthy, willing to cook and clean and keep a claim shanty running without complaint, quiet if the agency could manage it. He enclosed a tintype of himself, looking stern and clean-shaven, a photograph that flattered him by a good 40%. 3 months later, a woman stepped off the train at Larkspur Depot, who was 29, not 28, 5'9" in her boots, and had decided somewhere around the Wisconsin line that she intended to be absolutely nothing on that list. Her name was Adaline Voss. This is Yellowstone County, Montana Territory, autumn of 1882, and this is the story of the loneliest man in 3 counties, the letter he never should have sent, and the woman whose whole life had been spent refusing to be measured against anybody else's list. Stay with this one. The reversal comes on a Christmas morning in 2 words traded across a bare plank table, and it's worth every minute it takes to get there. And if stories like this one are what you come back for, tap join beside the channel name and become a channel member. It costs nothing, and it keeps these stories coming. Now, let's go back to where it actually started, not at the depot. At a letter written alone at a kitchen table by a man who had stopped expecting anything good to arrive by mail at all. Soren Halvorsen had come up from the Nebraska line into Montana Territory in 1876 with $65 a walking plow and a conviction so complete it barely qualified as an opinion that a man out here could build something with his own 2 hands and nobody would trouble him about how he built it. He turned out to be right about the building and dead wrong about the trouble. By the autumn of 1882, he had 150 acres of good bottomland along a nameless creek that fed into the Yellowstone, a log cabin he graduated to from the sod house he'd wintered in his first 2 years, 35 head of cattle bearing his brand, and a loneliness so complete it had developed its own weather. He was 35 years old, tall, fair-haired, built the way Norwegian farmers tend to be built, solid, unhurried, without a wasted motion in him. Smiling did not come easy to him. He believed a full day's work was its own kind of conversation, and most days that belief carried him, because there was nobody else out there for actual conversation to happen with. The ranch itself, by 1882, was proof of everything Soren believed about patient labor. He'd cleared the bottomland stone by stone his first 2 summers, dug the well by hand, felled and notched every log in that cabin himself over one brutal winter, and built a herd from 6 starter cows up to 35 head through nothing but careful breeding. Neighbors who watched him work said Soren Halvorsen approached a fence post the way other men approached scripture, with total seriousness and no patience for shortcuts. What none of that labor could fix was the particular ache of coming in from a 16-hour day to a cabin with nobody in it, of setting 2 plates on the table, out of habit, before remembering, every single evening, that there was only ever going to be the one. He had tried, for a while, to find a wife the ordinary way. The problem, as he worked it out, sitting alone at his table with a stub of pencil, was arithmetic. 14 unmarried men for every unmarried woman in the whole stretch between the river and the foothills, and a handful of women who were out there had already chosen men who talked more, laughed easier, and didn't spend Sunday supper silently counting how many words they'd used out loud since Tuesday. Soren had ridden 30 miles to a barn dance the spring before, stood against the wall the entire night, and watched other men do the one thing he apparently could not manage, which was simply talk to a woman without treating every sentence like it cost him something he couldn't spare. A widow named Ingrid Strome had asked him kindly enough whether he intended to dance at all that evening, and Soren had answered with 4 words and an excuse about the horses, and ridden home in the dark without trying again. It was a neighbor, a Swede named Karsten, who ran cattle 2 ridges over, who first raised the subject of the marriage bureaus advertising quietly in the back pages of the farm papers, agencies in Chicago and St. Paul that matched lonesome men on the frontier with women willing to travel west for the promise of a husband and a claim of their own. Karsten had written to one himself 2 winters back and come away with a widow out of Ohio who, by his own account, ran his household with more competence than he'd managed in 6 years alone. Soren turned the notion over for a month. The way he turned over most decisions, slow, thorough, the way a man checks a fence line before trusting it to hold cattle through a hard winter. When he finally sat down to write the letter, he did it the way he did everything else on that homestead, efficiently, without sentiment, and without wasting the lamp oil on a draft he'd only rewrite later. He described the acreage. He described the cattle. He described the winters as honestly as he knew how, the isolation of them, the particular silence of a Montana January that a person raised somewhere with close neighbors could not properly imagine until they'd sat inside it themselves. Age 20 to 28, in good health, capable of running a household and willing to help where the ranch required it. That was the request, plain as a grocery order. At the very bottom, he added a preference for a quiet temperament if the agency had any say in the matter. Nowhere in that letter did the word love appear. Nowhere did companionship. He signed his name, sealed the envelope, and rode the 14 miles into the nearest town to post it before he could talk himself out of the whole enterprise, and then he went home and did his level best not to think about it again for 3 months, because thinking about it felt uncomfortably close to hoping. And Soren Halvorsen had made himself a quiet, private policy, somewhere around his second lonely winter, of not doing that anymore. He had, in the 3 years since his last real courtship attempt fell apart over a misunderstanding about a church social, given up entirely on the notion that the ordinary way was going to work for a man like him. It wasn't that Soren disliked people. It was that every social gathering within riding distance seemed engineered deliberately to reward exactly the qualities he'd never had: easy talk, a ready laugh, the particular gift for making small conversation feel effortless instead of like translating a foreign language sentence by sentence in his own head before he dared speak it aloud. He'd watched men half as capable as himself with a plow or a rope win over women simply by being able to comment agreeably on the weather for 10 straight minutes. And he'd come away from every one of those evenings feeling less like a suitor. By the time he wrote that letter to the marriage bureau, he wasn't hoping for romance so much as hoping for an end to a particular kind of exhausting performance he'd never once managed to give. Adaline Voss was not, by any honest account, a woman who needed rescuing from anything. She had been raised in Milwaukee by a German immigrant father who ran a printing shop and believed, with an intensity that startled the neighbors, that a daughter's education mattered exactly as much as a son's. Adaline grew up with Latin verbs conjugated at the supper table alongside the potatoes, and a violin her mother had carried across the ocean wrapped in 3 layers of wool, and by 20 she could hold her own in a scripture argument with the pastor of her own congregation. She was tall, taller than most of the men who courted her, which had a habit of ending courtships before they properly started, with auburn hair that refused every pin ever invented for it, and a particular way of tilting her chin up half an inch whenever she disagreed with something. In a small Wisconsin town that liked its young women agreeable and unremarkable, Adaline had always been considered slightly too much of everything, too educated to be modest, too opinionated to be restful company, too striking to overlook, and too sharp-tongued to be easily won by the men who tried. Her father died the winter she turned 28, and the printing shop went with him, sold off to settle debts Adaline hadn't known existed until the ink on the paperwork was barely dry. She spent the following year keeping house for her married sister in Chicago, useful, welcome, and entirely without a room or a life that belonged to her alone, sleeping in what had been a sewing room before it became hers, feeling every single day the particular ache of being grateful for a kindness she hadn't chosen. It was her sister, of all people, who first mentioned the marriage bureau notice, half in jest, over morning coffee, the offhand way people suggest outlandish things when they don't expect to be taken up on it. Adaline took it up anyway. She read the notice 3 separate times, then walked to the bureau's office the following morning before she'd entirely finished, deciding to. The agency matched her against a homesteader's letter out of Montana Territory, quiet, capable, seeking a wife between 20 and 28. Adaline was 29. Rather than let that discrepancy quietly sink her chances, she wrote back and stated it outright with a bluntness that made the clerk reading it laugh out loud in an otherwise silent office, adding that if the gentleman in question found a single year's difference disqualifying, she would gladly withdraw and spare them both the postage. The gentleman in question, Soren, though she did not yet know to call him that, never saw the exchange at all. The agency simply forwarded her particulars along with everyone else's, and 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived confirming the arrangement, along with train fare and a departure date. Adaline packed 2 suitcases and her violin case, informed her sister she was going to Montana to marry a stranger, and never once, in the retelling afterward, described herself as frightened. Watching Wisconsin give way to Minnesota, and Minnesota give way to something flatter, and stranger still, she had made up her mind somewhere on that long westbound stretch that, whatever waited for her at the end of the line, she had spent her entire adult life being measured against a list, too tall, too educated, too much, and she had decided, quietly and privately, in a rattling train car somewhere past Fargo, that she would rather be turned away outright than accepted for being small enough to fit somebody else's requirements. Larkspur Depot sat at the end of a spur line that had reached that stretch of Yellowstone County only 2 years before. A single platform, a water tower, and a station master's office that doubled most days as the only reliable source of news for 40 miles in any direction. Soren stood on that platform on the 14th of September, wearing his one good coat hat in both hands, doing the single thing he was worst at in the entire world, waiting on something entirely outside his own control. He told himself, riding in that morning, that he carried no particular expectations. It was a lie, he told, with real conviction and no success whatsoever, because underneath the practical arithmetic of the whole arrangement sat a smaller, more embarrassing hope he had never once spoken aloud to another. The train came in trailing steam and noise, and the platform filled fast with the ordinary business of arrival. Trunks unloaded, a family reunited in tears, a drummer already unpacking a case of patent medicine for the first customer he could find. Then a woman stepped down from the second car alone. Tall, in a blue traveling dress, a shade too fine for a depot platform, carrying 2 suitcases and a violin case, she looked directly at Soren, the way a person looks at a fact she intends to deal with, not a stranger she's only just meeting. She crossed the platform without hurrying, set 1 suitcase down at his boots, and looked him over, hat to boots, and back again. "You're shorter than your photograph led me to believe," she said, "though I'll grant your chin is a considerable improvement in person." Soren, who had rehearsed absolutely nothing on the ride in because he hadn't imagined there was anything worth rehearsing, opened his mouth and found not one word waiting there for him. He picked up her suitcase instead. It was, in its own quiet way, his entire answer. The wagon ride out to the homestead took the better part of 2 hours, and Adaline spent most of it asking questions. Not the shy, testing kind, but direct, specific, the kind a person asks when she fully intends to use the answers. How far to the nearest neighbor, whether the creek ran year-round or only in spring. What the winters were truly like, not the version he'd written in the letter, but the honest one. Whether there was a church within riding distance, and failing that, a lending library, because she had 40 books coming by separate freight, and no intention of stacking them on a bare floor. Soren answered most of it in a single word apiece: 6 miles, year-round, cold, no church, no library, until Adaline finally folded her hands in her lap and studied him the way a person studies a column of figures that refuses to balance. "You're either a remarkably efficient man," she told him, "or a remarkably boring one, and I intend to have determined which by Thursday." Staring straight ahead at the rutted road, Soren felt something move in his chest. He had no word for, and no intention of naming out loud. "Thursday's optimistic," he offered. It was by his own private count, the longest sentence he'd spoken to another human being in nearly 4 months, and it startled a real laugh out of Adaline, surprised, unguarded. Nothing like the polite kind, and something about the sound of it in all that empty country settled into Soren Halvorsen's chest. He had expected, insofar as he'd let himself expect anything, a quiet woman content to keep to the house. What arrived instead talked like a trained auctioneer, quoted scripture and agricultural journals in the same breath, and by the second hour of the ride had already informed him his fence posts along the eastern boundary were spaced too close for proper drainage, a fact she could not possibly have judged from a moving wagon. Correct about, anyway. The last stretch of that wagon ride ran along a low bluff above the creek, and Adaline went quiet for the first time since the depot, taking in the country the way a person takes in something they intend to spend the rest of their life inside, the cottonwoods bare-branched already this far into September, Hawk turning slow circles over a stretch of grass that ran unbroken, clear to the horizon. It was, she would tell her sister in a letter written that first week, the loneliest and most beautiful country she had ever laid eyes on, and she genuinely could not decide, setting pen to paper which of those 2 facts frightened her more. The cabin, when they reached it, was exactly what 3 years of a single man's habits produce: clean enough, functional, entirely without warmth of any kind that didn't come directly off the stove. Adaline stood in the doorway a long moment, taking in the bare walls, the 2 mismatched chairs, the single shelf holding a Bible and a stack of unopened farm ledgers. She offered no criticism at all, which unsettled Soren more than criticism would have. She simply set her suitcases down, rolled up her sleeves, and by full dark had produced out of a kitchen she'd occupied for exactly 6 hours. An actual supper, not the burnt, apologetic kind Soren cooked for himself most nights, but something properly seasoned. Like somewhere a person might genuinely want to sit down. They ate mostly in silence, which suited Soren fine, and which Adaline tolerated for exactly as long as it took her to finish forming her next thought. When her plate was clear, she set down her fork with the particular precision of a woman about to say something rehearsed. "I think we should discuss terms." Soren looked up. "Terms? I have traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man I've known for the length of one wagon ride," she went on. "Whatever this becomes, it is presently a business arrangement, and business arrangements go a good deal better when both parties know exactly what they've agreed to. I will keep your house. I will cook and clean and help where the ranch requires it, and I will do all of it well, because I don't generally do things poorly if I can help it. In return, I want 3 things, and I want them agreed to out loud tonight, before either of us goes one step further." Soren set his own fork down. "Go on." "A room of my own, until we're properly married by a minister, and not merely by an agency's paperwork. A bookshelf, because I have 40 books arriving by freight, and did not carry them 2,000 miles to stack them on your floor, and the right to say no to anything, at any time, with no explanation owed." Soren went quiet long enough that Adaline began, for the first time since the depot, to look faintly uncertain. The smallest crack in the composure she'd worn like armor since Chicago. "You can have the room, and I'll build the shelf myself," he said finally. He paused. "The right to say no was already yours. It doesn't need my permission to exist." Something in Adaline's expression shifted, in a way she couldn't have named that night even under pressure. "That was the correct answer, I know," and he rose to bank the fire, missing entirely the way she watched him do it. By any honest count from the 3 lonesome years behind him, it was more words than Soren Halvorsen had spoken in a single evening since before his mother died. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both, in their separate and unspoken ways, came to rely on completely. Within her first week, Adaline had reorganized the entire kitchen along lines that made sense only to her, and turned out, once Soren stopped grumbling about it, to actually make sense. She repaired the chicken coop's sagging door with a hinge she found buried in his own tool crate. She started a cold frame of winter kale from scrap lumber salvaged off a fence he'd meant to rebuild for 2 years and never once gotten around to, and on the 4th morning, coming out to split kindling before dawn, the way he did every single day of his life, Soren found his own woodpile restacked. Not merely neater, but genuinely better. The logs turned so air could move clean through the stack instead of rotting the bottom layer the way his own careless stacking had been quietly doing for years without his ever noticing. He found Adaline at the well, drawing water, and stood a moment looking between the woodpile and her without a word. "Yours was going to rot from the bottom," she said, before he'd asked anything at all. "Air needs somewhere to go." He looked at the woodpile again. It was, he had to concede privately, a better stack than he had ever managed himself in 6 years of ranching alone. He didn't say so out loud. He built her the bookshelf the following morning instead, 3 shelves of planed pine, sanded until it wouldn't catch a stocking, with a carved edge along the top board that served no functional purpose whatsoever, and had cost him half a day he genuinely couldn't spare mid-harvest. By the standards of a man who measured every hour against the work it might otherwise have done, it was an act of near reckless extravagance, and Adaline understood it exactly as it was meant. An answer to a question neither of them had actually asked out loud. With no church within riding distance, Sundays on the homestead took a shape of their own making. Adaline began reading scripture aloud after the morning chores, first to herself, and then, once she'd noticed, he lingered near the doorway pretending to mend a harness strap. He didn't need mending. Soren never once said he wanted to listen. He simply found reasons to be in the room while she did it, sharpening tools that were already sharp, oiling boots that didn't need oiling, until by the third Sunday there was no longer any pretense involved, and he simply sat across from her at the table while she read, saying nothing, absorbing every word the way dry ground absorbs the first real rain of a season. She wrote to her sister that November that she had nearly married. She corrected herself in the letter. Still not married yet by paper. A man who could go a full hour without speaking and somehow make the silence feel like the opposite of lonely, which was because it happened to be entirely true. Late that month, Adaline rode with him into the stockyards outside town, where Soren was selling off 8 head to raise cash ahead of winter, and she watched from 20 feet off while a heavy-set buyer from an outfit near Miles City. The implication that a small operation like Soren's ought to be grateful for whatever number he offered. Soren, never much of a talker at the best of times, was losing ground by the minute. Adaline stepped in without waiting to be asked, cited the going rate from the last 3 auctions with dates attached, and named a figure a full $1 a head above what the buyer had opened with. The buyer took the deal rather than lose the whole morning, arguing with a woman who clearly had every number memorized. Riding home, Soren said nothing about it for almost a mile. Then, "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to see if you'd let me." He glanced sideways at her, and something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face before he caught it and put it away again. By November she was riding out with him most mornings to check the herd, sitting a horse with more determination than skill, falling twice in her first 2 weeks, and climbing back into the saddle both times without so much as a complaint. Brushing the dust off her skirt and telling him to go on ahead, she'd catch up. Without quite deciding to, Soren found himself slowing his own pace so she wouldn't have to. Neither of them remarked on it. There was a particular ridge above the north pasture where the whole valley opened out below, the river cutting silver through the cottonwoods, the mountains standing blue and serrated against a sky that ran on longer than any sky Adaline had known back in Wisconsin. And the first time they crested it together, she reined in her horse without meaning to, and simply looked. "This is the most beautiful place I've ever seen in my life. Why in the world didn't you say so in your letter?" Soren turned the question over slowly, the way he turned over most things. "Didn't think anyone would believe me if I did." Adaline, looking out over that valley, thought it might be the saddest true thing anyone had ever told her, and kept the thought to herself, because by then she understood he wasn't looking for pity over it. He wanted, if anything, someone to finally see what he'd been seeing alone for 6 winters running. The first real storm of that autumn caught them both out checking fence line 8 miles from the cabin, a fast-moving squall that dropped the temperature 20 degrees in under an hour and turned the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Soren read it coming before Adaline saw a single cloud worth worrying over, and they rode hard for a line shack. He kept stocked for exactly this kind of trouble, reaching it with sleet already turning to snow, and both horses blowing hard. They spent 4 hours crowded into a one-room shack meant for a single man and a bedroll, sharing what was left of a tin of coffee and a blanket Soren insisted she take the larger half of, and by the time the storm broke enough to ride home safely, something had passed between them that neither one could have named. The particular closeness of two people who had trusted each other, without discussing it, to read the weather correctly and act on it fast enough to matter. Adaline didn't mention being frightened. She didn't need to. Soren had seen it plainly enough in the set of her shoulders on the ride out, and had said nothing about it either, because saying so would have made it a bigger thing than either of them was yet ready to hold. Traveled, as it does in a country that thin on people, that Soren Halvorsen's mail-order bride had arrived and was nothing like what everyone had assumed a mail-order bride ought to be. At the general store in town, a woman named Grete Boysen, who had run the counter there for 11 years and considered herself the leading authority on every marriage within 40 miles. Halvorsen, not yet properly married but already claimed as such by the town's own bookkeeping, had opinions about scripture sharp enough to argue a preacher into a corner. The remark carried a note of scandal that didn't entirely hide a note of grudging admiration underneath it. Karsten, the neighbor who'd first mentioned the marriage bureau to Soren in the first place, rode over one Sunday under the thin pretense of borrowing a harness tool, and left 2 hours later thoroughly out-argued by Adaline on the subject of cattle breeding. A topic she had studied from agricultural journals, bought specifically for the train ride west, and now, apparently, understood better than men who'd worked cattle their whole lives. Karsten went home that evening and informed his own wife that Halvorsen had gotten himself either the smartest woman in the territory or the most exhausting one, and hadn't yet worked out which, though the man looked happier than Karsten had seen him look in 6 solid years. If you want to know how this one ends, the pine branches, the 2 words that finally crack him open, become a channel member, and tap join beside the channel name. December brought the first real cold of that winter, the kind Soren had tried honestly to describe in his letter, and had still somehow undersold. And it brought with it a fever that took hold of Adaline over a single gray afternoon. It came on fast, a headache, dismissed at breakfast as nothing, a shiver by midday blamed on the drafty front window, and by nightfall she was burning hot to the touch and barely coherent. Soren understood with the clear-headed panic of a man facing the one kind of trouble his hands couldn't fix directly, that the nearest doctor sat 90 miles off, and no amount of riding was going to close that distance before whatever this fever intended to do had already run its course one way or the other. He nursed her himself. There was no other option out there, and if there had been, it's doubtful he'd have taken it anyway. He boiled broth from the last of the autumn chicken and spooned it into her whenever she was lucid enough to swallow. He kept the fire built through all 4 nights, waking every hour without being roused, the way a man wakes when some part of him has quietly decided sleep is a luxury he can no longer afford. On the second night, with Adaline drifting in and out and murmuring something in German he couldn't follow, he found the small volume of Tennyson tucked among the 40 books on the shelf he'd built her, and began haltingly in the low, flat voice of a man who had never once read poetry aloud to another living soul. He stumbled over half the words. He kept going anyway, hour after hour, because it seemed to settle something in her whenever the fever ran hottest, and because it gave his hands and his voice somewhere useful to be while the rest of him sat there entirely helpless. On the fourth night, the fever finally broke, somewhere past midnight, quiet as a storm finally exhausting itself. Adaline woke before dawn, weak and soaked through and clear-headed for the first time in days, to find Soren asleep in the chair beside the bed, the Tennyson still open on his chest, where it had slipped loose from his hands, one arm resting near the edge of her blanket, close but not quite touching, as though even asleep some careful part of him had drawn a line he wouldn't cross without her leave. She lay there a long while, watching him breathe, watching the fire he'd clearly fed all night burn low and steady in the grate, and thought, with a clarity, the fever's passing seemed to have left behind like a gift. I came out here expecting a transaction. Somewhere along the way, without either of us marking the exact hour it happened, I found a person instead. She recovered slowly through the following week, and something between them had shifted in a way neither one named out loud, because naming it felt to both of them like it might spook whatever fragile thing had begun growing in that cabin. Soren still spoke in short sentences, Adaline still filled every silence he left behind with more words than strictly necessary. But there was a new quality to the quiet between his sentences and her words now. Something settled where there had once been only two strangers taking careful measure of one another. She noticed he'd started building the fire up a little higher than the ranch's economy strictly required. He noticed she'd started humming while she cooked, low and half under her breath, German folk tunes he didn't recognize but had come, without meaning to listen for every evening. One evening that same week, mending a torn hem by the fire while Soren oiled a bridle across the table from her, Adaline finally asked the question she'd been turning over since the fever broke. "Why did you never marry before the letter? A man like you, this land, this house, surely there were women in the territory who would have had you." Soren didn't answer right away. He worked the oil into the leather a long while, and when he finally spoke, it came out slower than his usual short sentences, like something dragged up from a good depth. "Figured I had nothing worth offering a woman beyond the work. Land, cattle, a roof. Never thought there was a version of me that had much else in it." He looked up at her briefly, before returning to the bridle. "Didn't know different till you restacked my woodpile and told me it was going to rot." It wasn't much of a joke, and he didn't deliver it like one, but Adaline laughed, anyway, low and real, and reached over without thinking to rest her hand on his for exactly as long as it took him to still under the touch and not pull away. Christmas that year fell on a Monday, and it would have passed away every Christmas had passed on that homestead for 6 straight years, unmarked, unmentioned, one workday indistinguishable from the next, except that Soren woke that morning to something he had genuinely not expected inside his own cabin. He came in from the barn chores before full light to find the whole front room transformed. Pine branches, cut from the stand behind the spring house, strung along the mantel and door frame. Candle stubs melted onto the lids of empty jars and settled on the windowsill, unlit yet but ready. Strips of red ribbon cut. He realized, with a small jolt, from the hem of one of Adaline's own petticoats tied along the pine boughs in careful little bows. And on the table, a plate of small, dark, spiced cookies he didn't recognize, still warm, that she'd baked at 4 that morning from ingredients carried the whole 2,000 miles from Chicago in the bottom of her trunk. Something locked shut in Soren Halvorsen for 6 straight years came open all at once, standing in that transformed room with the smell of pine and spiced sugar in the air, and a woman watching him with an expression somewhere between hope and outright defiance, as if half expecting him to call the whole thing too much fuss over nothing. He didn't. He stood there a long moment, working through something in his chest he had no easy words for, and finally spoke, quiet. "There's a word for this in Norwegian." She waited. Koselig. He turned the word over carefully, like something fragile. "It doesn't translate clean into English. Closest I can manage is the feeling of being warm when the whole world outside is cold. Being home, even when you're about as far from home as a person gets." He looked around the transformed room once more. "This is Koselig." Adaline's eyes filled, and she made no attempt to hide it or apologize for it the way she might have 3 months earlier, back when showing him anything unguarded would have felt like handing over a weapon. She gave him a word back instead. Wad. Geborgenheit, German. The feeling of being safe inside the warmth. They stood on opposite sides of that small table, the pine and the candles and the cookies between them, and neither one crossed to the other side. Neither one needed to. Something had opened between them that morning, and both understood, without a single further word, that it was not going to close again. They talked long into that Christmas night, the kind of talking that comes only after the careful walls between two people have finally come down, about her father's printing shop and the sister back in Chicago, about his mother, dead 9 years now, and the 2 brothers who'd stayed behind in Wisconsin, and the particular loneliness of 6 winters, spent talking mostly to cattle who never once talked back. It hung in the room regardless, plain as the pine boughs, and both of them knew perfectly well it was there, and both of them, in their own careful separate ways, were finally ready to say so. Soren asked her 3 days after Christmas, standing at the very well where he'd found her restacking his woodpile back in September, and he went about it in exactly the way anyone who knew him would have predicted, plainly, without flourish, every word of it entirely meant. "I ordered a wife once, wrote out exactly what I wanted, and mailed it off, same as ordering seed for spring planting." Adaline waited, one eyebrow lifting, ready to take offense on principle if this was heading anywhere near an apology for that letter. "It wasn't. You weren't any part of what I asked for. Not the age, not the temperament, none of it. You were better than anything I knew, enough to ask for, because I didn't know a person like you was a thing a man was even allowed to want." He reached into his coat and drew out a ring that had been his mother's, plain gold, worn thin at the band. "I'm not asking you to be what I ordered. I'm asking you to go right on being exactly what you are." Adaline looked at the ring, then at him, and finally said the thing she'd been holding back with more discipline than she'd held back anything in her entire adult life. That was the correct answer. And, because the first time those particular words had passed between them, it had been Soren answering with 2 words of his own, she handed the same 2 right back to him. "I know." Not everyone in the county was won over so easily. A widower named Ansel Dietrich, who'd made his own quiet overtures toward Adaline through the agency correspondence before she'd ever accepted Soren's letter, a fact Adaline hadn't bothered mentioning until well after Christmas, seeing no reason to trouble a settled matter, rode out to the homestead in early January under the excuse of a neighborly visit, and made it plain enough in the careful roundabout way men like Dietrich preferred that he considered a woman of Adaline's evident refinement wasted on a man who could barely string together. Adaline heard him out with the same composed patience she'd once used to negotiate cattle prices, and then informed him, without raising her voice above the tone she'd have used to discuss the weather. Expressed itself in a woodpile stacked to let the air through, and a bookshelf built from scratch, rather than in easy conversation at a social Dietrich, left within the half hour and did not return. Soren, who'd stood silent through the entire exchange, chopping kindling within clear earshot, said nothing about it that evening beyond a single sentence over supper. Didn't need defending, to which Adaline replied that she hadn't been defending him at all. She'd simply been stating a fact. They were married on the 14th of January, 1883 in the cabin itself, because the nearest church sat 30 miles off, and neither of them saw much sense in waiting for spring roads to say what they already both knew plainly. A circuit preacher named Amos Cole rode through a genuine blizzard to reach them. Soren had sent word by a rider 2 weeks prior, and half expected the man not to come at all, given the roads, and arrived half frozen and entirely good-humored about the whole ordeal. But never before in a cabin with a bookshelf standing in for half the wedding party. The witnesses amounted to Karsten and his wife, who rode over despite the weather, and the 12 books already crowding the shelf Soren had built, which Adaline maintained counted for something, regardless of how the preacher was meant to record it in his register. She wore the same blue traveling dress she'd arrived in that September, because it was the finest thing she owned, and, because there was a particular rightness to it, neither of them commented on out loud. The same dress, the same woman. One certain stranger who had waited on that depot platform 4 months before. Amos Cole, once he'd thawed enough by the fire to properly conduct a wedding, remarked that in 22 years of circuit preaching he'd rarely seen two people stand up before him looking less like strangers and more like something already decided. He asked the customary questions in the customary order, and Soren answered his in the same short, unadorned sentences he used for everything else in his life, meaning, Adaline answered hers with the same steady clarity she'd used to negotiate terms across that same table 4 months earlier. And if Cole noticed the echo, a woman stating her intentions plainly, a second time, in the same cabin, he didn't remark on it, though, that he'd married a great many couples out of practical necessity in that territory, men and women who'd known each other 3 weeks, and needed a wife or husband to survive a winter, and precious few of them had looked at each other the way Soren Halvorsen looked at his new wife. The ceremony itself took perhaps 10 minutes. The supper afterward, cooked by Adaline before the ceremony, because she refused to let her own wedding day pass without a proper meal on the table, took considerably longer to eat, mostly because nobody in that cabin was in any particular hurry to leave it. Outside, the blizzard carried on through the night, burying the fence lines and the woodpile and the whole valley under a clean, unbroken white. And inside, for the first time in 6 years, Grethpoisen, who had once traded that first bit of scandalized gossip across her own counter, lived long enough to sell Adaline dress fabric for all 4 of her children's weddings in turn, and told anyone who'd listen that she'd known from the very first winter the Halvorsen match would outlast half the marriages made the ordinary way in that county, a claim nobody could quite disprove, and one Grethe herself had certainly not believed at the time, though by then nobody troubled to remind her of that. They ranched that stretch of the Yellowstone Valley together for 41 years. The bookshelf Soren had built with 3 shelves and one, useless, beautiful carved edge grew over the decades to 9 full shelves crowded 2 books deep, and Adaline's violin got played most Sunday evenings for as long as her hands stayed steady enough to hold the bow, filling that cabin with music that carried on the still nights and clear out past the north pasture. They raised 4 children on that land. Elsa, born that first autumn of the marriage before the summer heat had properly broken. Then Gunnar, then the twins, Hilda and Peter, who arrived in the same February storm that had nearly kept the preacher from reaching them years before. A coincidence, Adaline always maintained, was the valley's own particular sense of humor. All 4 grew up knowing the story of the letter and the auction, and the woman determined from her very first sentence to be no man's specification, a story they carried into their own adulthood and repeated themselves later with the particular fondness of people telling a family legend they never once tired of hearing, usually finishing it the same way their mother always had, that the best things in a life never arrive as the order a person placed, only as the thing that shows up anyway and simply refuses to leave. The homestead grew alongside them, the herd built past 200 head by the turn of the century, a second cabin raised for the eldest son when he married, a schoolhouse Adaline herself helped fund 3 miles down the valley road. Soren Halvorsen died in the spring of 1923, 76 years old, in the same cabin he'd raised with his own 2 hands, with Adaline seated beside him. She lived 12 years past him, long enough to see grandchildren grow tall in that same valley, and is buried next to him on the rise above the homestead, where the whole country opens out below, exactly the way it did the very first time she ever saw it. He had ordered a wife by mail the way another man might order cattle or seed or lumber. With a list of specifications he was certain at the time described exactly what a lonely man needed. What arrived instead refused, from her very first sentence on that platform, to be any single thing on that list, and what the 2 of them built together over one hard winter and 41 years that followed it, turned out to be so much better than anything either of them had known enough to ask for in the first place. Because that, in the end, is usually how the best things arrive, not as the order you placed, as the thing that shows up anyway and simply refuses to leave once it gets there. If this is the kind of story you come back for, you already know what to do. Like it, share it with someone who'd love it, and tap that join button beside the channel name to become a channel member. It's a small thing that makes a real difference.